Hello, I'm Jim Lindsay. I am the director of the Robert Strauss Center for International Security in Law, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here tonight. It's a very exciting night for us to have our guest of honor. I want to begin by saying that tonight's conversation with Senator Nunn has been made possible by the John Brumley Chair in Global Affairs. The Brumley Chair was created a little over a year ago in recognition of the fact that modern technology is a double-edged sword. It makes our globalized world possible, but it also has the potential to wreak havoc. The Brumley Chair addresses this dilemma by funding and supporting research and debate on how to develop peaceful ways to ensure that technological and scientific advances do not endanger global security. The chair was made possible by a very generous gift by John and Becky Brumley. John and Becky are both distinguished alums of the University of Texas. John has had an illustrious career in the energy business. He's now chairman of Encore Acquisition Company. Becky is the chairwoman of the Red Oak Foundation. Both are in Fort Worth. We're very fortunate that John and Becky are with us here today. Can I get you to stand up so we get a full-throated applause? We are really delighted and honored to have as our guest tonight a man whose career is a testament to the mission of the Brumley Chair, Senator Sam Nunn. I think it is safe to say that Senator Nunn is one of the most prominent and influential voices on defense issues in the United States. He was first elected to the United States Senate way back in 1972. He served with distinction until 1997. During his 24 years in the United States Senate, he distinguished himself as a leader who was admired by both sides of the aisle. He made his name as a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, where he served both as ranking member and as chair of the committee. He was the driving force behind the passage of the 1986 Defense Department Reorganization Act with the late Senator Barry Goldwater. I think most people in my business regard the DoD Reorganization Act of 1986 as the most important piece of defense legislation of the past 50 years. Senator Nunn was also the driving force behind the creation of the Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, which provides assistance to Russia and other former Soviet republics to secure and destroy their excess nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. To date, the program has deactivated approximately 6,000 nuclear warheads. Senator Nunn has continued his commitment to reducing the threat of nuclear weapons since leaving the United States Senate. He is currently the co-chairman and chief executive officer of the Nuclear Threat Initiative, which works to reduce the global threats from nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. It's also, I think, important to point out at a university that Senator Nunn is also a professor of International Affairs at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech. So I'd like you all to join me in giving a warm Texas welcome to Senator Nunn.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
What we're going to do tonight is have a conversation, and eventually we'll bring the whole audience into it. First, I would ask everyone who has a cell phone or BlackBerry if you could mute it or otherwise silence it so we don't have sudden outbreaks of music by the Jonas Brothers. That would be very good. And I also want to point out that Senator Nunn, as many of you know, because of his prominence and influence, gives advice to lots of people in public life, but tonight he is here speaking on his own account, not speaking on behalf of the Obama transition team or anybody else, as we agreed. Senator, it's probably best to begin at the beginning, and I would note that throughout your career, you have been seen as a staunch advocate of defense policy. Many media reports describe you as being a hawk. So I think it comes as a surprise to a lot of people to discover that you have devoted so much of your time to efforts to rein in nuclear weapons. How did you come to be interested in nuclear weapons as an issue?
Well, Jim, first let me thank all of you for being here this evening. I'm among a lot of friends. I know Linda, Rob, and Wayne, and I think I see Beth over there, and others. Wayne, Beth, she won't sit with you anymore. Anyway, they're old friends, and it's great to be here in a building that has so much history and is named after President Johnson, who signed the non-proliferation treaty 40 years ago. And I believe, Linda, it's 100th birthday this year, and I wrote Bob Strauss a letter on his 90th birthday the other day. So there are a lot of names around here and a lot of faces that have meant a lot to me in my career. I got started on the nuclear business a long time ago. I graduated from Emory University Law School in 1962. I went to Washington. My great uncle was the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, and he had told me for several years if I ever got a law degree that he would have a job for me if I passed the bar exam. And so both of those things happened, and I went to Washington in June of 1962. I had a boss by the name of John J. Courtney, a great Irishman, and I was working for a subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee as a lawyer. Mr. Courtney came in October of 1962 and said that he was supposed to go on a trip to Europe with the U.S. Air Force, but he had to cancel. It was a trip that was composed of staff members of the House and Senate Appropriations and Armed Services Committees. And he asked if I wanted to go. Well, I'd never been out of the country, and so of course I said yes. And so I embarked on an Air Force trip to Europe for 3 weeks. After we'd been there about 1 week, the Cuban Missile Crisis broke out. And I was there during that whole period of time. Everybody on the trip were cleared for top secret, so we were watching the photographs in real time, and we were with the Air Force most of the time. And right at the peak of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the tension was the highest and when it looked like the world was going to go to war, certainly it would have been a nuclear exchange had it started, in my view. I was sitting by the four-star general who was head of Ramstein Air Force Base near Wiesbaden, Germany, and he had his whole communication gear back of him. It was as big as this whole back of the room. It wasn't like today where we have all the digitization. And he explained to me that he had something like a minute and a half to get his planes off the ground. They had one-way missions. They were fighter planes, but they had nuclear weapons on them. They were called forward-based fighter aircraft. The pilots would go deliver a nuclear weapon, bail out on the way back, plane would be ditched. So they were the first targets. They would have been the ones that the Soviets would have hit first, and he had to get them off the ground quickly. He said on that particular night he had the pilots sitting in the airplanes. They weren't even sitting, by the planes. They were right in the planes, ready to take off. So it was a close thing. It impressed me. I was 24 years old then, and it had a profound effect on me. I said to myself during that period of time, during those days, that if I ever had a chance to do something to make the world safer, particularly from the threat of nuclear weapons, which basically could destroy God's creation, that I was going to do so. So I spent a great deal of my career. Many people didn't follow it that closely, but I felt I went to NATO in 1974 after I got elected to the Senate at the request of Senator Stennis, who was chairman of the Armed Services Committee. And I came to the conclusion, after spending a great deal of time before I went and over there, that we were relying on the early use of nuclear weapons, tactical battlefield nuclear weapons, to a degree that was dangerous for both us and the world. I felt that that was a very bad defense posture, that we needed a stronger conventional force posture. I thought we needed to be able to have a much better capability of defending, at least in the first stages of any kind of outbreak of a war between the Soviet Union and NATO, without going to nuclear weapons. I talked to enough of the people on the front line of the battlefield at night when it wasn't a formal briefing to conclude that they were not only going to request the early release of nuclear weapons, but they were going to do it even before they thought they needed them, because they thought there would be a delay of 5 or 6 days back in Washington. So I did not believe the policymakers in Washington understood how quickly, particularly those in the White House and the chain of command, how quickly they were going to be asked to give permission to release battlefield nuclear weapons, which were, by the way, battlefield nuclear weapons sound small, but most of them were about the size of the Hiroshima bomb. but they were primarily short range that would have hit in Germany, and they would have been targeted against a Soviet tank formation. That was our way of trying to deter a conventional war. Long story short, I spent a lot of my Senate career trying to strengthen the conventional balance. So I've been in this business for a long, long time. I've also, Jim, worried about the whole terrorist kind of problem for a long time, because back in those days there was terrorism in Germany called the Bonner Mannhof gang, and they were basically doing everything they could to get U.S. forces out of Europe. One of the visits I went on to NATO, I went to a tactical nuclear weapon base. This was in the 70s, where we had weapons stored. It was out in the countryside. We had thousands of battlefield tactical nuclear weapons there. As I was leaving, I'd gotten kind of the standard dog and pony show from the top military officials there. And as I was leaving the actual base, I shook hands with the sergeant, and I felt a note crumble up in my hand, and it said, "This is all BS, Senator. If you want to know the real story, come by the barracks, and me and my buddies will tell you what it's all about." And this was after, of course, the Vietnam debacle. The Army was demoralized. We had a lot of drugs, a lot of alcohol, a lot of anti-officer sentiment by the enlisted personnel. So I went by the barracks that afternoon late. I did not have any of the top military people with me. And I got a horror story about how badly secured our tactical nuclear weapons were, and how we did not have good perimeter fencing, we did not have good electronics, we did not have good technology in terms of surveillance. We did not have good relief squads coming if some 8 or 10 terrorists had tried to take over that small base. So I went back and reported directly to Jim Schlesinger, who was then Secretary of Defense, about all the problems we had with the tactical nuclear weapon side. And so I got involved then with the problem of terrorism, and since that time I worried just as much about a small group of terrorists getting control of a nuclear weapon as I did about a deliberate nuclear war. In fact, I worried more about it, and certainly that is accentuated since that time. So that's kind of the background. It's a long background, but I've been involved in this for a long, long time.
I'm struck, Senator, how you described the situation you saw in the 1970s. I think most people would have the impression that nuclear weapons of whatever sort would be under severe lock and key, a lot of security. It makes me wonder, because you mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis and how close we came to a potential nuclear war. We managed to go through the Cold War without having a nuclear exchange. I'm left wondering how much of this was by design as opposed to luck.
Well, the way I've described it in the past is that on both sides of the Iron Curtain, in both the NATO and the Soviets, there were a lot of dedicated individuals, men and women in uniform and civilians, who were very diligent, who were very energetic, and who knew the stakes involved and did everything they could to prevent an accident or miscalculation. So we were good, but we were also very lucky. And I do not believe the next 50 years, with the proliferation of the number of nations that have nuclear weapons, we're on the verge of several more, and if Iran gets nuclear weapons, there are going to be a lot of them lined up. I don't think we can be as lucky in the next 50 years. And I don't think the proliferation of nations involved in nuclear weapons will be able to be as good or as skillful as we were with the Soviets. And we had some very close calls, including but not limited to the Cuban Missile Crisis, that taught both the Soviets and the United States and our NATO allies the dangers of any kind of war breaking out, because it could have so easily escalated to nuclear war. So the whole horror scene of what could have happened did help prevent any kind of war. I'm not sure those lessons are going to be able to be applicable to countries like India and Pakistan and others in the world as we get more and more nuclear weapons. So I believe we have been very lucky. And I believe that luck is not likely to hold for the next 30, 40 years unless we change directions in a very significant way, de-emphasizing nuclear weapons, making sure that we do everything in regional areas like Pakistan and India and the Middle East to lessen tensions there overall so countries will not feel they have to have nuclear weapons, making sure that we keep dangerous weapons and materials out of the hands of terrorist groups or countries that would use those weapons, and then ultimately having a goal of getting rid of nuclear weapons in the world. That goal has got to be a long-term goal, but it is a goal that I think is essential if we're going to get other countries to cooperate with us, because there are a lot of countries in the world, we can get into that on the non-proliferation treaty discussion, who believe that the non-proliferation treaty committed the countries with nuclear weapons to get rid of those nuclear weapons, while it also committed countries that did not have them never to have them. And they believe that that bargain has broken down, and that therefore we've got a real challenge in terms of the non-proliferation treaty, because all three legs of that treaty are eroding in terms of where we are today. So we have to have a vision of where the world is going, as well as a lot of concrete steps to be able to get there.
Senator, I want to talk a little bit about the vision, but first I really would like to talk about the Nunn-Lugar program. Can you tell us a little bit about the origins of it, how it came up? Because at the time it was quite radical, and I think, as you know, there are many people who were unenthusiastic about the notion of using American dollars to help a former adversary.
Well, I'm sure a lot of you in your lives have had certain junctures that had a profound effect on you, and then you went on to other things, and that background music had a lot to do with your decisions later on. Well, that was the case with me. I've recited my experience in 1962, my experience in 1974-75 relating to NATO. Well, my experience also was a very formative experience in 1991 when the breakup of the Soviet Union. I was in Hungary, Budapest, Hungary, and I was with a conference of Soviet experts. And one of them was we had some Russians there, some members of the Soviet Union, and one of them was a friend of mine, been a friend of mine for a long time, named Andrei Kokoshin. He was later the #2 person in the Yeltsin Defense Department. Nevertheless, he left early in that conference because Gorbachev had been taken captive with the attempted coup in the Soviet Union. He had been gone about 2 days, and Gorbachev was released. We were still at the conference. It was about a week conference. He called me on the phone and said, "Sam, you've got to come to Russia." He didn't use the term Soviet Union. He said Russia. And I said, "Well, I don't have a visa. I know you got a lot of things going over there. It's mass confusion." Yeltsin was on the ascendancy, and Gorbachev had been released, but he was still officially head of the Soviet Union. And Andrei said, "I'll have the Russian ambassador," use the term Russian again, "in your hotel in 30 minutes with a visa." And I said, "Well, I've watched your bureaucracy work for a long time, and I don't believe that's going to happen." He said, "Well, go down and wait for him in 30 minutes. He'll be there." So I went down. He had a visa. I left immediately, went to Frankfurt, and got on a plane. I was actually paged in the Frankfurt airport by the U.S. ambassador in Moscow, saying, "Don't come. It's mass confusion over here. There are thousands of people around what they call the White House, and we can't even set up appointments with you. We don't even know who's in control." But I went because I knew that Andrei was going to take care of me when I got over there. So I spent a fascinating about 5 days there. I had one interview after another out in the White House with the generals who had been on the side of those who were opposed to the coup. I talked to people in the next 5 days all over about their military situation. I came to the conclusion during that period of time that the Soviet Union, of course, was going to break up. I sat in the parliament, or their Duma, and listened to the debate about the breakup of the Soviet Union for 2 days. And I came to the conclusion that we were going to have the breakup of the Soviet Union, and it was going to come apart with literally hundreds of thousands of chemical weapons and thousands of nuclear weapons and biological weapons spread over about 11 time zones. I felt it was a prescription for disaster, so I went back to Washington, and we had the authorization bill. I was chairing the committee. We had the defense authorization bill in conference. We'd already passed it in the Senate. The House had already passed their bill, so we were in conference. Les Aspin was chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. I convinced Les that we had a desperate situation, that we needed to put a provision in the conference report for the United States to use our defense money if the Russians and others, by Russia by then, would accept it, to get control of their nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. And the same thing with Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Belarus. There were 4 countries that had thousands of nuclear weapons. Ukraine and Kazakhstan had more nuclear weapons on their soil than Britain, France, and China total. So these were not insignificant supplies of nuclear weapons. And so that's where the Nunn-Lugar program came from, but it's a little longer story than that. We put it in the authorization bill, we brought it back to the floor of the Senate, all hell broke loose, Democrats and Republicans furious about having that provision in there. We were still seeing the Soviet Union as an enemy, and of course that was natural, and no one could understand why we would use U.S. money to get control of their weapons. Well, we had to pull that provision out of the conference report, take the conference report back, bring it back without it, because it was obviously going to kill the whole conference report. I then recruited Senator Lugar because I knew I needed a strong Republican. He was one of the most respected, still is, members of the Republican Party and one of the most respected senators. Senator Lugar and I started having small groups of senators meeting and discussing this for the next 2 months. We brought a provision back up on the appropriation bill in December of 1991, and at that stage we had convinced a lot of senators to change their mind. We passed it by something like 92 to 8, and we put $400 million in for the use of the Department of Defense. It was discretionary. They didn't have to do it, but it was there to be used if they could use it. It started under that in 1991. It took about a year to get started. There was a rather cool reception in the Pentagon and the White House at that stage, but they warmed up to it later, and by 1993-94, it was in full effect, and it's still ongoing now. It was a partnership. We couldn't have done it without the Russians, the Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Belarus. But to just give you a little example, that program helped the countries like Kazakhstan and Ukraine and Belarus, some of whom wanted to give up their nuclear weapons, some of whom did not, get rid of all their nuclear weapons. So all of those countries got rid of them except Russia. And we also, as Jim said in the introduction, I believe there's something like 7,300 warheads that have now been destroyed, all sorts of missile silos. But more important, it's been a confidence builder between those countries and the United States. And we also have grown out of that a lab-to-lab program where we work with the Russians on a lot of things. So on the nuclear side, we've made enormous progress with the Russians in protecting nuclear materials and weapons. It's not just the weapons, it's the materials also, because the materials were spread all over 11 time zones. Enough nuclear materials were in the Soviet Union breakup then to make something like 100,000 hydrogen bombs. So it was a pretty dicey time, but that's the background. Now, the background that enabled me to come to that conclusion and be so convinced that I was right on the subject was that tactical nuclear experience way back in '74 when we had come out of Vietnam with a demoralized military, and I saw how dangerous it was when your military is demoralized, and I sort of used a multiple of 100 about how demoralized the former Soviet military was at that stage. So that had a lot to do with my being convinced that the Nunn-Lugar program, as it turned out, was the right thing to do.
Are you satisfied with how much progress has been under Nunn-Lugar, or do you think we have done something but not everything?
I think the latter. I think we've done a great deal, but not nearly enough. We've had a lot less cooperation on the biological side. I think the biological challenge will be in the future for the young people in this room will be just as great as the nuclear challenge is for this generation. And we need to work with the Russians on biological. They made a huge number of biological pathogens that could be used in weapons. They weaponized, we don't know how much, they weaponized a great deal in the way of biological. They even were working at one time on a smallpox pathogen that would be resistant to all known vaccines. So we really need to work with them. They didn't use those weapons. I don't think a civilized nation would ever use those weapons, but they had thousands of scientists that knew how to make them. And there are people in the world that would use those weapons. So we need to work with them on that. I'm nowhere near satisfied with the pace on the biological. We've done a lot on the chemical. We have an agreement to get rid of all chemical weapons. You cannot believe how much in the way of chemical weapons the Soviet Union made. Senator Lugar and I visited one site with 1,991,000 artillery tubes full of nerve gas about this long. Each one of them would fit in a big briefcase. And they were stacked in ceilings of barns that were about as high as this, one after another. You went in with a gas mask on. It's just unbelievable how much. We're working with them to destroy those stockpiles now. So no, I'm nowhere near satisfied. We've got a long way to go. There's a whole nother tier of work that has to be done on research reactors. That work is just getting started. There are countries all over, there are over 40 countries around the globe that have highly enriched uranium that is weapon-grade material in research reactors. So it's not just Russia, it's not just the former Soviet Union. This stuff is spread all over. So we've got a long way to go. But we do have to elevate this program to much more of a partnership. The Russians are not going to continue to be a supplement for funds. There's a tremendous strain between Russia and the United States now. We can talk about how that came about and whose fault it is, but nevertheless it's there. So the Nunn-Lugar program is not, in its present form, is not going to be able to continue, in my view, for many more years. Now, I think that tight concept will be able to continue, but the Russians are going to have to step up to the plate and be a partner in this. And we've worked together so well, so long on this for 16, 17 years, that it's time for both of us to work together to help countries around the globe get control of this stuff on a global basis. And it's not just weapon-grade material. Radiological material is spread everywhere. You've heard of dirty bombs. Those are bombs that don't detonate in the nuclear explosion sense, but would be radiological weapons that would poison a whole area. And we're fortunate we haven't had that happen. So we do have to have partners. Russia is a logical partner in this regard, and I think that there is hope that we can work with them. They are beginning to realize how much danger there is to them. They didn't for a long time, and the great value of the Nunn-Lugar program was with the funding, we got them to concentrate on the dangers in their countries that concentration would not have happened with all the other problems they had after the breakup.
In recent years, you've gone beyond the Nunn-Lugar issue, and in January of 2007, you co-authored an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal with former Secretary of State George Shultz, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry. That's a heck of a lot of intellectual firepower and political clout, and it sent, I think, real shockwaves to the foreign policy establishment, because I think you alluded to a little bit earlier, you argued for setting forth a vision of eliminating nuclear weapons. Can you tell us a little bit about what led to the writing of that op-ed?
Well, if you back up 1968, 40 years ago, when President Johnson signed the non-proliferation treaty, it was understood around the world to be a deal between the countries that had nuclear weapons and those that did not. And it was three legs on the stool. One leg is that the countries with nuclear weapons would give them up over a period of time, step by step, over a period of time. The second leg of the stool was that countries that did not have them would not try to obtain them. The third leg of the stool was that all countries would be able to have access to technology for peaceful purposes, nuclear power purposes, medicinal, medical purposes, and others. Those three legs are all eroding now because the countries that don't have nuclear weapons, including some of our best friends in the world, don't believe that we and the Russians and the French and the British and the Chinese are ever going to give them up. So that credibility has eroded tremendously, and it's had a profound effect. The countries like Iran and North Korea are trying to get nuclear weapons, and we've, of course, trying to make sure they don't. That's an extremely important mission. But we have to have a lot of cooperation in the world to be able to achieve that. And we know that terrorists are trying to get nuclear materials. There's no question about that. Almost every intelligence report has said that. Then you add to that the fact that there's this loose nuclear material all over the globe, and you add to that the basic fact that if terrorists get weapons, they would probably use them, and you've got a pretty good storm brewing. In fact, I call it a perfect storm. And then you add to that nuclear power, which we need in the world. I'm in favor of nuclear power, but that effort to get nuclear power gives a lot of countries right now, the Iranians, a chance to exercise what they consider to be their right under the non-proliferation treaty to enrich. and they do have a right to enrich under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So they get a lot of support from countries around the globe as they enrich, because they contend they're only going to enrich to a low enriched level. Low enrichment technology is the same as high enrichment technology. You just take it to a higher scale. So the same technology that makes low enriched uranium, which is a perfectly legitimate procedure under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, can also be used to make high enriched uranium, which would make a bomb like Hiroshima or much worse. That is the dilemma. Now, the Iranians have violated their NPT commitment because they have been clandestine in what they've done. They've hid that program. But it's not the enriching that is the violation. It's the lack of truthfulness in reporting. But it's a very tricky area. So, long story short, Kissinger and Shultz and myself and Bill Perry spent a lot of time together in the last 2 or 3 years, and we came to the conclusion, it was a slow evolution for me, that if we were going to get countries around the globe to take the steps we needed, and there are a lot of steps we need, to avoid catastrophic terrorism, to avoid the proliferation of nuclear weapons, that we had to go back to the basic premise of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and make clear to the world that we were serious about the vision of a step-by-step approach to get rid of all nuclear weapons over a period of time. And that would not be unilateral. It would be with other countries. Is it hard? Is it difficult? Yes. Will it take a long time? Yes. But we came to the conclusion that without the vision, the steps we needed to protect ourselves would not be possible, and without the steps, the vision would not be realistic. So that was the way it evolved. A lot of discussion back and forth. George Shultz, probably more than anyone, had the vision because he had worked with President Reagan, and President Reagan over and over and over again, both while he was president and after he was president, articulated the strong goal and desire to get rid of all nuclear weapons, including his meeting in Iceland with Gorbachev, where they almost agreed to get rid of all nuclear weapons. At that stage, I was not in favor of that. I felt that we had too much conventional imbalance in the world, but that's another whole story. But Reagan had that vision for a long time, and George Shultz had that vision. So all four of us came together with a different background. Each of us had a bit different background, but each of us came to the conclusion that both the vision and the steps was necessary, and it was going to take a partnership between countries that had weapons and did not, and it was also going to take a strict kind of control of all nuclear materials wherever they are around the globe.
So as you have this vision of eliminating nuclear weapons, how do we translate that vision into practical steps? What do we do first?
Well, you basically, there are a lot of dimensions to it. If it were me, I would say the most important dimension right up front is U.S. and Russia working together, because they have huge amounts of nuclear material. And of course, we're doing that under the Nunn program. But we have a long way to go. We also, both the Soviet Union and the United States, we basically were competitive in furnishing highly enriched uranium to countries that wanted to put in their own research reactors. We did not think then that it was easy to make a nuclear weapon. We felt it would take a Manhattan-type project, but that was a bad miscalculation. So this stuff is spread all over the globe. So we need to work with Russia to get it back. And we are doing that finally, but it's much slower on a program called Global Threat Reduction Initiative. Our foundation that I chair has worked a great deal on that problem. Russia has something like 40 research reactors where they have highly enriched uranium. That's not covered by any program. So we need to work on that. Now, working with Russia is very difficult. We all know that. Extremely difficult. Right now, they are very upset because we're putting in missile defense in Czech Republic and Poland. They believe that eventually these sites will be expanded and it will be aimed at their deterrent, and they will be threatened. They believe that we would have enough missiles there at some point to really threaten them. Now, we take the position that we're only going to have 10 missiles. It's only aimed at the Iranian threat. But they look at us and they say, what Iranian threat? They don't have long-range missiles now. So there's deep suspicion on this one. But it's also an opportunity. Actually, President Putin, several months ago, perhaps tactically, but I thought we had an opportunity to really take it as a strategic move. He basically offered the use of Russian territory if we did not deploy the radars in Czech Republic and the missiles in Poland, Russian territory where we'd work together. Now that was Reagan's vision, to work together with other countries on ballistic missile defense. He had in mind a much more comprehensive system. This is a very limited system, but it would be very useful for accidental launch. We don't have fail-safes on missiles. You've always heard about bombers flying over and they have fail-safes. No fail-safes on missiles. If one is released, all you can do is dial up and say, I'm sorry, one's coming your way, it was an accident. That's not a good situation. So we could work with Russia on missile defense, and I think that needs to be one of the first things a new administration tests. It may be difficult, it may be long. The advantage we have, though, we are deploying a missile defense system that has not been thoroughly tested. It's a premature system against a threat that has not yet matured. So it's a premature system against a premature threat that has not developed yet. So we do have time. If we could work with the Russians on missile defense, it'd change the whole equation. Because if we were working with them on defense, we would both, I think, over a period of time conclude, well, why don't we take some of these weapons off hair trigger alert? Why do we have thousands of weapons pointed at each other that can destroy not only our countries, but much of the world? And I think we would work together with them on warning time. People have to sort of step back to think about this, and even a lot of our military people don't think of it this way. But we have an existential threat in the Russian warning system working. If that warning systems go haywire and they get false reports, guess who is targeted? It's us. They have an existential threat in our warning system working. So we ought to have worked together on warnings. If we work together on warnings, perhaps India and Pakistan would get the signal at some point, because that's probably the most dangerous place in the world for technology. So I would start, there are a lot of steps, but I would start with trying to work on missile defense. A fundamental step, and one that our foundation has been dedicated to for the last 8 years, is encouraging governments all over the world to get control of all nuclear material, to get any highly enriched uranium and get it secured first and then blend it down so it's not weapon-grade material, and to get control of the radiological material around the globe. There are a lot of dimensions of that. While we're getting control of it, we need to have an agreement, and this is something a new administration, I think, needs to work on with other countries around the globe, to stop producing fissile-grade material. We don't produce it anymore, and we ought to be encouraging other countries not to continue to spew out that material. I know you had a discussion about India this afternoon. It's very relevant to that India discussion. We also need to quit using highly enriched uranium in commerce. It was thought of not to be a dangerous thing for a long time. Now we know that terrorists, if they get highly enriched uranium, can probably figure out, if they've got a few people that have scientific background, how to make a crude nuclear weapon. They're not going to make a weapon that flies through space and is sophisticated. They're going to make one that you put in the back of an SUV and drive across a border and blow up a part of a city. But it would change the whole world. It would change the economic equation. It would change everything. So getting control of fissile material, getting control of all of that is very important. Something we need to do in this country is ratify the Threshold Test Ban Treaty. We're not going to test anymore. We say we're not. The laboratories say we don't need to test. But that treaty got defeated in the late 1990s. That has done more to damage us in the view of other countries in the world than anything else. There are all sorts of safeguards you can put into that deliberation, but we do need to ratify the Test Ban Treaty. So all of these things require cooperation and leadership. It will take a president of the United States really making this a priority to begin to happen. But none of this is unilateral. We're not going to get rid of our nuclear weapons until other countries get rid of theirs. That's fundamental. So it's got to be, we got to move together on this situation. And the other countries that have small numbers of nuclear weapons are not going to begin thinking about getting rid of their nuclear weapons until Russia and the United States come way down on our inventories. And no country where there's great tension is going to get rid of nuclear weapons if they feel they are going to be overwhelmed with conventional problems. That will be true of Israel within the Middle East. It will be true Pakistan and Southwest Asia. So this is a long road to go. But if our children and grandchildren are ever going to see a world that is is much more stable than the one we live in now, then we've got to have, I think, that kind of dedication, that kind of vision. The way I describe it is a world without nuclear weapons is like a very tall mountain. The top of it is the peak where you reach it at some point in the years ahead of a world with no nuclear weapons. But right now, we're not heading up the mountain, we're heading down. And it's getting worse. And so we've got to first stop heading down the mountain. And then we've got to find base camp, and we've got to head up and see if we can get to base camp, and we've got to get other people to move up the mountain with us. And one of these days, maybe my children or grandchildren will be able to, from base camp, see the top of the mountain. So it's directional. It's an aspirational goal, but it is also directional and enormously important psychologically around the globe. Interestingly enough, 2/3 of the living former Secretaries of State, Secretary of Defense, and National Security Advisors have endorsed the vision and the steps now. And we've also had the British government, Gordon Brown specifically, endorse the vision and the steps, and a lot of leaders around the globe. So we're getting, for the first time in a long number of years, some real momentum on this subject. Hopefully it'll give us enough credibility to really begin to be serious about taking a lot of these absolutely essential steps.
Can you tell us a little bit about how it's been received in other countries? I know that you and Secretary Schultz and Perry have been trying to talk to lots of leaders. Anything you can tell us?
We had a conference in Oslo where we had a large number of countries there. I think there were 20, 25 countries there represented. It wasn't a formal, all this is track 2, this is not government to government. We had a conference in London where we had a number of former defense ministers and foreign ministers. There is a commission formed under the leadership of the Japanese government and the Australian government now that Bill Perry actually serves on, that is going to be intensely looking at this for the next couple of years. So we've got a lot of interest around the globe. I think the main thing that we've done by 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, all of whom have served for a long time in government, getting together and coming out with this declaration, is we have, the Non-Proliferation Treaty had the vision but didn't have the steps. What we've done is we've said both of them have to go together, but we have created the political space where a lot of young people are talking about this subject now that weren't talking about it. The political space is now open for that kind of discussion. It will take an awful lot of young people, not just in this country but around the globe, to move in this direction. It'll take a lot of scientists, too. We need to bring the nuclear labs in it. I see Ray here, and I know he was on the panel this afternoon, and Ray is one of the real experts in terms of his background and so forth. It's going to take a lot of work by nuclear labs because we've got to have verification. And we've got not only to be able to verify this, we've got to be able to verify materials. Now, we're working on technology now where you can basically tell whether there's nuclear materials from pretty long distances. The Russians are probably even further ahead than we are on that. We're not working with them now. We have a chance to work with them on that because you've got to have verification, and then you've got to have the political will for enforcement. We don't have the technical verification that we need on a lot of this yet, but we're working on it, and we're nowhere near the will, the political will in the world to really enforce. You can witness that on the Iranian situation now. The world has got to get a lot more cohesive in terms of its approach, both with carrots and sticks, if you're going to enforce.
I'd like to bring the rest of the room into the conversation now, if I may. And if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone. Someone is supposed to bring a microphone over. I'm looking for my crack microphone staff to rush to the... Oh, we're trying to get the microphone off. In the interim, if I may, I was a small mistake on my part in the intro. I forgot to thank the librarian of the LBJ Library, Betty Sue Flowers, for allowing us to use this absolutely wonderful facility. So, thank you, Betty Sue. I think Paul Monk over here has a question to ask. Gentleman right here. Paul, if you could raise your hand so they can see you. I can see what they can't.
Thank you very much. Senator, you drew attention to the problem of terrorists possibly getting hold of nuclear materials at a time when we're coming, in your terms, down the mountain. But critics of the alarms about terrorism have often said, look, If terrorists could get hold of this stuff, why haven't they done it already? If they were so keen to set off even a dirty bomb, why haven't they done it already? I wonder if I might ask, what do you think has constrained them from getting hold of it so far? Is it the success of efforts to prevent it, or is it just luck? And the second part of the question is, you said, should a radiological bomb go off in a city, it would change everything, implicitly very much for the worse. But I wonder whether at least the threat of it, and just conceivably the actuality, if heaven forbid it actually occurred, might actually accelerate the coming together of efforts to abolish nuclear weapons. It would actually lend momentum to to greater alarm, to greater seriousness. I wonder if I could get you to address those two sides of the question.
On the latter question, if a nuclear weapon went off in a major city in America or in Russia or anywhere else on the face of the globe, would it give impetus to really getting rid of weapons? I think it would give a lot of impetus to taking these steps, but it might also set off exactly the opposite. It might also set off a rush for countries to have nuclear weapons, and it might also set off other would-be terrorist copycats now that they know somebody can do this, a group of individuals to do it. So it could go either way. I don't know how it would work. In terms of whether terrorists, why they haven't gotten them already, well, a lot of work's been done. I mean, we've been working for 16, 17 years, and during the Cold War, a lot of people worked hard to prevent a nuclear accident happening then. So a lot of work's been done, but also the nuclear materials the nuclear weapons themselves have been better protected than materials. What I worry about is the materials. The weapons themselves are better protected. I worry more about tactical, small battlefield weapons than I do other. There were all sorts of rumors that some of them had gotten away during the Soviet breakup. We don't know what we don't know. There are PAL devices, permissive action links, on a lot of these tactical nuclear weapons. In my view, the United States and Russia, we have pretty largely done that. The Russians haven't. Need to get rid of every tactical battlefield nuclear weapon that doesn't have PAL devices on them, meaning if somebody got the weapon, they couldn't set them off. We don't know what we don't know. There are reports out all the time that nuclear material has disappeared. Some of those are false reports. Director Al Verde, head of IAEA, has said on several occasions when I was there that one of the most alarming things to him is when we find nuclear materials and discover them, most of the time they haven't been reported as missing. So we just had a break-in in South Africa of one of their facilities that has large amounts of highly enriched uranium. South Africa had a nuclear program at one time. They gave it up. But they still have very large quantities of nuclear weapons. There were several attackers, I believe 4 or 5, that got into this facility. They killed a guard. They were there 45 minutes. They got away. The South African government says that they didn't get any material. We don't know what we don't know. We've had no access to that facility in the United States. A lot of strain between the South African government and the U.S. government now, a lot of distrust. We actually made a movie. Any of you want it, we give it away. It's called Last Best Chance. We got Fred Thompson. This was before he ran for president, but he played the role of president, did a great job. It was a fictional movie, but the fiction portrayed that very plan in South Africa as being taken over by a group and basically going in and substituting a fake container for a large container containing highly enriched uranium, and basically the authorities did not know that anything was missing. So again, all you can say is you don't know what you don't know. I do have some comfort in the fact that I believe if a terrorist group had nuclear material, and I believe if they had decided and figured out how to make a weapon, I think they would use it. So the best case is that they don't have it. But I kind of view it, Warren Buffett has been, he's been the big supporter. Ted Turner and Warren Buffett have been the big supporters of our foundation. And people ask me what are the odds of a nuclear weapon going off, and our friend Graham Allison, he gives odds, and Bill Perry gives odds. I never give odds, but I always cite Warren Buffett. And he says if you take, hypothetically, if there's a 10% chance that a nuclear weapon will be detonated on American soil in a given year, and that chance persists at 10% for 50 years, there's a 99.5% chance over that 50-year period, statistically, that weapon is going to be used. If, however, you can reduce the 10% chance to a 1% chance, again hypothetically, and that 1% chance persists over 50 years, then you have a 67.5% chance of avoidance. So that means there's a huge payoff in reducing the risk. No guarantee, but a huge payoff. And that's the way I view it, is a huge effort for risk reduction. And what we really have got to do is get other countries in the world to realize the danger as much as we do. Because this is one of those things, and to all of our frustration, the increasing number of them, including our current financial challenges, that cannot be addressed by one country. It's got to be a partnership. I call it a race between cooperation and catastrophe. And I think that is where we are. Again, I would say this is not the subject today, but I think the same thing is true on the biological side. And we need a lot of bright young minds out there that are thinking about infectious disease, biological terrorism, how the two come together, how we set up early warning and detection systems, and how we work around the globe on early detection of any kind of outbreak of disease. Americans have a vital stake in preventing the spread of infectious disease all over the world. What is in Africa or Asia one day can be in the Austin or Dallas airport the next day. And so that is another whole dimension of where we need to cooperate.
Young lady in the back. In the back.
I had two sort of different questions. I was wondering, the first question is, on this mountain that you were talking about, that would disarming Israel's nuclear program be a good place to start in terms of encouraging non-proliferation in general, and in particular encouraging Iran not to develop a nuclear program?
Would you repeat that again?
Would disarming or focusing on Israel's nuclear program be a good place to start on this sort of mountain in terms of encouraging non-proliferation in general, in particular Iran's nuclear program? And then the second question is, what is the incentive for a country to actually get rid of nuclear weapons rather than just say that they get rid of their nuclear weapons?
Okay. The second question, what does it require for countries to get rid of nuclear weapons? Well, let me give you some hope. I mean, it's not all despair. Kazakhstan got rid of all their nuclear weapons. They had a huge inventory. And their president, Nazarbayev, wrote a book about how proud he was they got rid of their nuclear weapons. And he is really wants Kazakhstan to be an example of the world. We are working with them to get rid of their last stockpile of highly enriched uranium. Our foundation is. It's one of those that falls through the governmental cracks, but we're helping them. We put up $1,300,000 and encouraging them to switch their last research reactor that uses highly enriched uranium to low enriched uranium. So that's an active program. So Kazakhstan's a good example. South Africa gave up their nuclear weapons. They actually tested, so they had a nuclear weapon. Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons. Taiwan, South Korea both had nuclear programs and stopped those nuclear programs. So this is not hopeless. A lot of countries have. In Ukraine, let me give you an example. I call it a parable of hope. The Ukrainians were really debating after the '91 breakup of the Soviet Union. Senator Lugar and I went over that probably 5 times. And at one point it looked like they were not going to give up their weapons. At one point it looked like there was so much strain between Russia and Ukraine. I was convinced that the Russian General Staff had a plan to go in and take back those weapons, a military operation. I thought we got very close to it, but that was my own subjective judgment in talking to both sides. Nevertheless, Ukraine finally came around reluctantly to give up their nuclear weapons. And the way they did it, highly enriched uranium has a value because it can be blended into low enriched uranium and sold as nuclear fuel. They said, we want the value out of our weapons. We don't want to just give them up. We want the value out of them. So we made a three-way deal. Bill Perry, Ash Carter, a bunch of people in the early 90s under the Clinton administration worked with the Ukrainians and the Russians. We got the Ukrainians to give their warheads to the Russians where they were blended, where they took them apart. They took the highly enriched uranium out, and they blended it in low enriched uranium. We bought it. We're still buying it. It's atoms, you can call it the ultimate in atoms for peace program. But the Ukrainians got their proportionate value and are still getting that proportionate value out of that. When you look at the nuclear power industry in this country, you've got 20% of our electricity comes from nuclear power. 20% of electricity comes from nuclear power. 50% of the material we use to burn for nuclear fuel comes from that program. 50% of the fuel. So if you look at any building, any electricity anywhere, 1/10 of it, 1 out of every 10 light bulbs in this room is being fueled by nuclear power statistically, and it was in the form of nuclear warheads aimed at us back in the 1990s. So there's hope. Who would have ever dreamed that could have occurred back in the Soviet days? There's real hope. On the first question about Israel, I think Israel giving up their nuclear weapons, they don't acknowledge they have nuclear weapons. It's assumed by the world that they do. They do not acknowledge that. I think the Middle East being one of the most troubling areas of the world, you've got to work the regional problems as a condition precedent. You've got to have some kind of a peace agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians. You've got to have, I think, a two-state solution. You've got to greatly ease tensions in that part of the world, and you've got to have countries that are on their borders no longer say they want to basically exterminate Israel. Those are all conditions precedent. Those are steps that we need to work on anyway, but Israel wouldn't, in my view, nor would Pakistan give up their nuclear weapons unless you greatly reduce the tensions. As long as countries think that they're going to be at a tremendous disadvantage with conventional forces, they're not going to give up their nuclear weapons. And so we've got to work on the regional balances. One way to do it, as I mentioned a little while ago, is working with Russia. We have a big stake in Russia being part of the Atlantic Euro security arrangement. They're not. I've said in a speech in Berlin earlier this year before the Georgia-Russian conflict that it was a failure of U.S. foreign policy, a failure of Russian foreign policy, and a failure of European foreign policy, that Russia has no real role in European security. You can debate a long time about why and whose fault that is, but as long as that exists, you're not going to get Russia to be comfortable in moving beyond a certain level. They're willing to reduce where they are now, but they're not willing to give up. So you've got to work the regional issues. And that's one of the things. The Non-Proliferation Treaty has been a tremendous and valuable tool, but it has to be updated. And we have to understand the steps are essential. And the most difficult step of all, I've talked about a lot of them tonight, is getting a resolution of a lot of the regional tensions. And that would certainly be true in the Middle East with Israel.
Yes, a gentleman in the back. Yes, you.
Okay, I don't have to wait for the microphone or not. Oh, great. Oh, thanks. Yeah, a couple quick questions for you. I want to talk about crude oil for a second because the day before the 4th of July this year when we all were going out and partying to celebrate our nation's independence, the price of oil was at $145 a barrel. And I just noticed today it closed at $49.87, under 50. Now, how does that change our dealings with Iran? How does that change the dealings with Russia? And then the quick second part of my question is projection of U.S. soft power with India, since we've just recently started opening up nuclear technology with them, and how does that offend China, and how does that, again, it all ties together, because I think Russia kind of has things to gain from destabilization with Iran. They obviously did when oil was at $150 a barrel. So, you know, it allows them to be more aggressive with their words and stuff. So just what are your thoughts on all of that in the next 4 years or 10 years?
A lot of thoughts on it. I'd say, number one, that in the current economic situation that we're in with people really feeling the pain and with the confidence level being down, not just in the United States but around the globe, the fact that crude oil prices have come way down, and the fact that people are seeing some real relief at the gasoline pump is like a massive tax cut. It's something like 190 billion tax cut is taking place at the gasoline pumps. That's the good news. The bad news is that alternative energy, whether it's nuclear or whether it's solar or whether it's geothermal or whether it's wind or whether it's whatever it is being dealt a very severe blow now. And the bad news is that we're going to go back into this same cycle, because when we come out of this world recession or whatever we're heading toward, then you're going to see the demand go back up, and you've got all sorts of countries that already were depleting their resources faster than they were replacing them, including Russia, including Venezuela, and including our neighbor Mexico. So we're going to go back into the cycle again. I don't know whether it'll be 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, or 5 years, but you're going to see prices of crude oil go back up. If it had been up to me, and again, I want to repeat Jim's admonition here, I'm not speaking of anybody but myself. I've had no conversations with any of the people in the administration or to-be administration. While the price was high, I said a number of times I would have put a floor under it and taxed it if it got below that floor, and refunded the money to people who were getting hit by it, the impact, as well as put probably some money into research and development. For instance, when the price was 120, if we had put the floor at $80 a barrel, saying if it went below 80, we were going to basically have a tax so that any competitor, anybody working on alternatives out there, would have some idea what the economic playing field was going to be about. Right now, you're seeing companies not only in the alternative energy, but in the production of oil and gas, where it's very expensive, pulling out of projects. You're going to see a much more rapid depletion. So that's the bad news. Right now, you can't do that. I do not advocate that now, because the economy is too shaky to put any kind of tax on, in my view, any new tax on anybody. So I would not do it now. I would have done it then, and the next time around, I would think about it. You've got to give the president that authority, though, in advance. You can't start debating it when the price of oil, and you get into a world recession and the price of oil starts going down. You've got to do it in advance, and whether we'll ever have enough trust in our Congress to pass something in advance on a contingency basis and give that kind of power to the president is doubtful. But that's, in my view, what we should do. What I think we shouldn't do is have the government picking winners and losers. This is a vast field. It's extremely complicated. We're going to be relying on oil and natural gas for a long time to come. So we've got to produce more oil and more natural gas. It's not one thing or the other. Everybody wants to pick out a pet rock and say we want either solar or we want geothermal. It's not a pet rock out there. You've got to have it all. And you've got to have, more than anything else, conservation. You've got to have conservation. And one of the things that I really hope doesn't happen is that everybody goes back to their wasteful habits because the price of oil and gas and all the things have come down. That would be a tragedy for the country. So the new incoming government, President Obama has said over and over again that he wants alternative energy. The economics are working against that now. The economics are working against it. So it's going to be a real challenge. And I think it would be a very bad mistake for the government to decide that solar is the answer, or geothermal is the answer, or wind is the answer. Economics, we need to figure out some way to level the playing field so people know what the economic signals are going to be. In terms of the repercussions around the globe, I mean, Russia and a lot of other countries thought they were somewhat decoupled from the U.S. economy. We found pretty clearly around the globe that there's no decoupling, that everybody is coupled together, and that the confidence level and the financial debacle that has occurred is affecting everybody. Russia's had to close their stock market on a number of occasions because they were having basic, absolutely chaotic markets. It's affected the growth rate in China. And China's been the engine that's been pushing the world growth rate more than any other. When they get below 8% growth rate, they feel like they have real social problems. Mm-hmm. So they are unleashing a lot of their pent-up reserves. But one of the big problems in the world is that we've got these huge dislocations of capital. Energy is one area of that. The other is The United States, we're a society of consumers. The Chinese and Japanese and others in Asia are a society of savers. So you've got these huge savings pools building up in these countries. They're lending the money to us to buy their goods. I mean, you can make the case that the Chinese are financing the war in Iraq. And you can make the case that the Chinese are financing whatever you want. 50% of our debt is held by foreigners now. We no longer owe it to ourselves. And so we've got a capital system. Everybody, we're sort of in a mutual assured destruction economic system around the globe. But if all of a sudden, and they won't do it because it would be detrimental to them, if all of a sudden the Chinese and Japanese quit buying our treasury bonds right now, then you would see American interest rates go sky high to be able to attract the capital. So we've gotten in these habits, and the new administration, in addition to all the other problems, has got to help lead the world into a different type financial structure, not only on the regulatory side, but on the capital side. And then the bottom line is America's got, not in the next 2 years, we need to spend in the next 2 years, but in the long run, we've got to become a nation of savers. We've got to have a lot bigger savings pool. Otherwise, just the pure economics, we're having to borrow for our own consumption. And that's not sustainable over a period of time. So that we're going to see a lot of economic adjustments coming out of this financial. It's spread way beyond the financial community now. It's pervasive, but we've got to restore confidence. What I would advocate now is a big stimulus program in this country, but at the same time putting on the books a restraint in the growth of entitlement programs in the out years, not immediately. That would be another hard thing to do. I mean, chewing gum and walking at the same time is tough, and it's very hard to explain. The next president's going to have to be the best communicator we've had in the last, I think, 50 years. He's going to have to explain the fiscal problems. He's going to have to explain the energy challenges. And what we really need to do is put on the books things that are effective in terms of spending restraint in 3, 4, 5 years, and a stimulus program for the next couple of years to really accelerate the restoration of the economy. I mean, one example, the Department of Defense. It would be my view that the new administration would take a look with Secretary Gates and others who are already there and say, what are the defense programs that we know we're going to have to buy over the next 10 years? And which ones of them can be accelerated? Which ones can we save money on by buying more units now and less units later on, so that we accelerate the next 2 years where we need to get the economy going again, but have restraint in the cost in the long run. Those are things that I think we've got to be able to do in some fashion, but you have to have a much more in-depth understanding of that in the American public to be able to get the support to do it, and in the Congress. But the Congress cues off the American public. I don't know whether I answered all those questions or not, but that's my thinking on it.
Okay, Colonel?
I have a question. You mentioned
Multiple
the
colonels.
Missile Defense Agency. You mentioned the Missile Defense Agency and the ballistic missile shield. Do you think that's had any impact on the desire to develop weapons against the United States, or is it just really a layer of protection for the United States, such as the isolated launch?
I think if the Russians conclude that they are going to be vulnerable, that their deterrent will be threatened by our missile defense program, they will develop offensive capability in every direction to be able to overcome it. Now, at this stage, in my view, that would be a ridiculous expenditure because we've got a very thin system in mind. We're not talking about defending against the whole Russian arsenal of thousands of nuclear weapons. We're talking about being able to stop an Iranian attack with a small number of weapons, or an accidental launch, or a rogue submarine commander. So I think, though, that if you're not careful with the defensive side, it unleashes huge offensive capability. That's why we had an ABM treaty, anti-ballistic missile treaty. It was in effect for a long, long time. We don't have it anymore. The United States basically wanted to develop its missile defense, so it basically got out of the ABM treaty. It was, in my view, we didn't handle that one quite right, but nevertheless, that's been done. That's where we are now. The Chinese will also react. if they believe that we're developing defensive systems so that they are a small number of nuclear weapons, most of which they don't even put with their missiles, or the last time I got briefed on it, they didn't. So they don't match up the warheads with the missiles, which is a much safer posture. And I've said for some time that I wish we in Russia would get more like the Chinese before the Chinese get more like us. Because we got them sitting there ready to go. I call it hair trigger, others call it prompt launch. Nevertheless, that's the way the world's heading right now. So yes, there is a definite relationship between offense and defense. If you think that your offensive systems are going to be successfully defended against, you're going to develop all sorts of techniques to basically overcome that. And that's why I think Ronald Reagan, in his deepest instincts, was right about cooperation on missile defense. It would be a great thing if both Russia and the United States, if there was some kind of accident, would be able to knock down the missile before it hit the other one on a cooperative basis. It would be a wonderful thing if we had a defense against a renegade Tom Clancy-like submarine commander. It would be a terrific thing if we were able to work together to counter what may be a big challenge in the future, and that is the use of digitization in cyberspace for a rogue group or another country to take control, command and control of a country's nuclear weapon command system. I don't think they could do it to ours, but I think they possibly could do it to some of the others. All of those things are kind of the deck of cards we're going to be playing with in the future. And a cooperative missile defense program, as hard as it will be difficult, could address all of those subjects. And also have a huge breakthrough in the confidence and trust between the U.S. and Russia.
Okay. Colonel, do you still have a question?
Yes, good evening, sir. Sir, do we currently have a conventional military advantage over Russia and China so that we could unilaterally decrease our nuclear weapons?
I don't believe in unilateral reductions. I think whatever we do needs to be done together, starting with Russia. Now, the other nuclear countries, China's not going to reduce until the U.S. and Russia come down substantially because we have thousands and they have hundreds of weapons. I think that we have a huge advantage in terms of intelligence, in terms of surveillance, in terms of target acquisition, in terms of air power. So we have a lot of conventional advantages. The former Soviet Union and Russia, they've greatly, our expenditures on defense now exceed the rest of the world combined, or just about the same. So we have some substantial advantages. We don't, it depends on where the war is. I mean, if you're not going to invade China, you don't have any advantage in invading China. I hope we don't have any plans for that anyway. But you know, if we have a conflict over Taiwan, we would have substantial naval advantages. The Chinese would be able to disrupt traffic if there was a confrontation over Taiwan. They would be able to, if, you know, their best scenario in Taiwan would not to even start a war, just fire missiles at ships and let them miss them, and just disrupt all the commerce coming out of it, bring down the economy. The reason they probably won't do that is it'd bring down their economy too, because Taiwan and China are, very much linked. You know, the good news is the Chinese and the Taiwanese take the long view. We don't realize how patient they are. So I believe that situation over a period of time will ease. I think that our job now is to make sure we have good relationships with China and with Russia. But the answer to your question is we would have substantial conventional advantages, and that's the reason we need to have a very in-depth dialogue with the Russians about where their fears are. I think we need to understand more where their fears are. Of course, our allies will have to be very much a part of it. There's a program at the Kennedy School that's been going on about 15 years, and it's a U.S. and Russian generals getting together for about a week conference. You may know some people who've attended it, and it's a fascinating program. Until the last few days, they were about to call the program off for this year. My view of it is when you have tensions, you need to be able to talk. I disagree with the Bush administration fundamentally on the fact that they seem to think you punish people by not talking to them. I don't think that's punishment. I think you have to have communication. And so I believe that kind of communication is good. I suggested to the people running that Russian U.S. generals program that we both talk about red lines. You know, in the Cold War, we knew where the red lines were. I don't mean red in the communist sense. I mean where are the lines that both sides know you shouldn't cross. We developed those over a period of time. Arms control talks, even when you don't get anywhere with arms control talks, they're valuable because you begin to sense where the red lines are, where you shouldn't cross them without the real war. We need to reestablish some of that kind of dialogue with the Russians. Obviously, when we expand our NATO alliance all around Russia, you look at the history of Russia, they're going to react. I mean, they are going to react. And it may be that we don't think it's entirely logical, and it may be that we think their fears are greatly exaggerated, but they are going to react. And Russia, with the resources they have, they've been down and out for quite a number of years, but they still are a huge factor. And I said the other day, and I think it bears repeating, that it's time for U.S. and Russia both to take a deep breath and count to 10, and while they're doing it, fill in 10 things that we have to work together on each side, because we are the key to them being integrated into the economic system of the world, and they are the key to a lot of these problems we're talking about on the security side and on the energy side and on the environmental side. It won't be easy. We won't agree with them on everything. There are no Thomas Jeffersons over there ready to take over, but we need to talk, and we need to understand each other. Same thing with the Chinese. I think looking at the broader picture, in spite of the problems we've got in the world today, if you look at the interest, the common interest of Russia, China, the United States, Europe, and Japan, I think there's more common alignment of interest today than there has been in the last 100 years. But we're not acting as if that's the case. None of us are.
We have time for one more question. I've neglected this side, so we'll go to the back. The gentleman in the back, yes?
Thank you, Senator. You mentioned earlier that the U.S. and countries like France and Britain do not want to get rid of their nuclear weapons. And I was wondering how much of that behavior contributes to the desire of countries like North Korea or Iran to seek to obtain nuclear weapons, especially after they have been labeled as members of the Axis of Evil.
You know, I do not believe that the North Korean and Iranian nuclear programs, are coming about because the United States and Russia still have nuclear weapons. What I do believe, however, is that it's a lot more difficult for us to get other countries in the world to join us in really cracking down very hard, hopefully without war, but with sanctions, economic, whatever the steps we take, on either North Korea or Iran, because other countries in the world, including our friends, basically think that we have, in effect, forgotten our non-proliferation commitments to move toward a world without nuclear weapons. And so I think it makes it a lot harder to deal with Iran and North Korea. But I believe if Russia and the United States were to make a large amount of progress along the lines that we've talked about tonight, I don't think it would, all of a sudden, the Iranians would say, we've seen the light, we're going to get rid of our nuclear program. I don't believe that. I think we would get a lot of help, though, from other countries in that region. Most countries in that region don't want the Iranians to have nuclear weapons. The Russians don't want the Iranians to have nuclear weapons. But we have not been willing to engage diplomatically with the Iranians, and I think that a lot of countries, including a lot of our best friends, believe that even if we don't succeed, we have to engage diplomatically with the Iranians as a prelude to tougher steps later on. It's going to be very hard to get other countries to join with us in the tough steps if Iran continues that nuclear program, unless they see us as having engaged diplomatically. Now, engaging diplomatically requires a lot of preparation. It requires a careful analysis of who's going to do the talking, at what level. It requires coordination with our allies, all of those things. But I do think that we need to engage diplomatically with the Iranians, even if it proves to be less than successful. One of the things we have to keep in mind, not only would the Iranian development of nuclear weapons threaten Israel and the whole region, but it would precipitate a lot of other countries in that area believing they had to have nuclear weapons. There are 10 countries in the Middle East who have signed up for preliminary assistance from the International Atomic Energy Agency about possibility of developing their own nuclear program. Now, there are a number of those countries that are probably legitimately going to develop nuclear power. For instance, the UAE, they are going to develop nuclear power, but they have made it clear they're not going to enrich. We believe that there are other countries that would not enrich, but if the Iranians keep enriching, you're going to see a number of other countries start enriching, and enrichment leads to nuclear capability, even if that nuclear capability is latent and not put into effect. There are countries that will, maybe even the Iranians, that want to get to the point where they would have a virtual capability. One other idea that I think is worth mentioning, because you don't see much good about Russia in the U.S. media over here, but Russia's come up with an interesting proposal, and the Bush administration supports it. And it's a facility called Angarsk in a very remote area of Russia, and they're going to have an enrichment facility there. They already enrich, of course, they've been enriching for a long time, and they're going to have it totally under IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, safeguards, and they're going to let other countries own equity in it, so that countries would be able to own a part of enrichment facilities, which would give them a certain degree of insurance. What I visualize is a tiered approach to this enrichment, so that the United States has proposed, the Bush administration, cross guarantees. So if one country that is committed contractually to sell nuclear fuel defaults, other suppliers will come in. The Russians have their Angarsk proposal. The Japanese have a proposal. Our foundation, with Warren Buffett's backing, I went over to Vienna 2 years ago and proposed a $50 million contribution to the IAEA to own their own backup, internationally held fuel supply that would be a guarantee if the market failed. And we said that if we got 2-to-1 match, that we would give $50 million, meaning $150 million to put in a small but at least insurance policy controlled internationally. We now have within $35 million of getting that match. The U.S. government's put up $50 million. The Norwegians have put up money. It looks like the UAE in the Middle East has put up $10 million. And so it looks like we're going to be able to come close to getting that. What I envision in this area, to again give some hope, is that series of guarantees. And I also envision that everybody who enriches, including the United States, Russia, all of us, including some that are exempt now, would be under inspection. So we have an international inspection regime of all enrichment taking place 24 hours a day. I think it's going to take that to prevent the kind of world we don't want our children and grandchildren to live in. Thank you for your attention very much. Enjoyed it.
That was spectacularly done.
Thank you.
That was terrific. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.